She had $12 in her purse. Barely enough for dinner. But when 28-year-old Mallory saw the man shivering in the rain, something inside her refused to walk away. She gave him her daughter's snack. Invited him to sleep on her porch. Let a complete stranger into the tiny apartment she'd worked 2 jobs to afford. What Mallory didn't know was that the homeless man she called Greg was actually Horace Whitmore, billionaire CEO worth over $3 billion. Mallory Chen's life was a carefully orchestrated survival. At 28, she juggled 2 jobs, waitressing at Miller's Diner from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., then stocking shelves at Savamart from 4 to 11 p.m. Between shifts, she raced home to her 6-year-old daughter Gillian, helped with homework, made dinner from whatever she could afford, then headed back out into the night. Every dollar mattered. Every minute counted. Exhaustion had become her constant companion. But here's what made Mallory extraordinary: Gillian never saw her mother struggle. Every morning started with smiles. Every evening ended with laughter and bedtime stories. At 28, Mallory carried the weight of the world, but in front of her daughter, she was invincible. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in late October when everything changed. Mallory was walking their usual route home with Gillian when they passed the park bench near the street lamp. Dozens of people had walked past the man sitting there, soaked through, clothes rumpled, completely still in the pouring rain. Some ignored him. Others laughed. One woman clutched her purse tighter. But 6-year-old Gillian stopped and stared with those observant eyes that noticed everything. She asked her mother why the man was sitting alone in the rain. What Mallory and Gillian didn't know was that the homeless man on that bench was Horace Whitmore, 35-year-old founder of Whitmore Technologies, one of the most successful companies in the city. Worth over $3 billion. For 6 months, Horace had been conducting an experiment. Disguised as homeless, he traveled from city to city, watching how people treated him when they thought he had nothing. He'd been mocked, ignored, spat on, called a waste of space. He'd built his empire from nothing, and somewhere along the way realized he was surrounded by people who only wanted his money. His colleagues saw dollar signs. His dates saw luxury vacations. Nobody saw him. So he'd left it all behind to find out if anyone would show kindness when he had nothing to offer. For 6 months, the answer had been no. Until Mallory stopped. Mallory looked at the man on the bench and saw something beyond the rumpled clothes and scraggly beard. She saw loneliness. The kind she recognized from her own mirror on the hardest nights. She reached into her purse and pulled out the granola bar she'd packed for Gillian's snack. It was all the food she had. She offered it to him. The man stared at the granola bar like it was made of gold, his hands shaking when he finally took it. Gillian, with the innocent directness of childhood, asked if he had a house to go to. The man said no, not right now. Did he have a family? The man's smile was devastatingly sad. No family either. Mallory checked her watch. She was already late for her evening shift. Her manager would write her up. But she couldn't walk away. She asked his name. The man hesitated. Then said his name was Greg. It was a lie. But Horace couldn't bring himself to say his real name. Not yet. Because for the first time in 6 months, someone was treating him like a human being, and he was terrified of losing it. Gillian introduced herself with a bright smile, and the man, Greg, smiled back with genuine warmth. After a moment, Mallory made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. She invited Greg to come home with them. Just for tonight. Just to get out of the rain. Horace stared at her in shock. This woman had barely enough for herself and her daughter, and she was inviting a stranger into her home. Gillian clapped with excitement as they walked the 3 blocks to Mallory's building. Mallory's apartment was a tiny 1-bedroom on the 4th floor. Small but spotlessly clean despite her exhausting schedule. She showed Greg to the covered porch area outside her door, inside the building but not inside her apartment. A compromise between kindness and caution. She brought him a blanket and pillow, then offered the bathroom if he wanted to clean up. When she made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup for dinner, she'd made enough for 3, which meant splitting her own portion. They ate together at the small kitchen table. Gillian talked non-stop about school, her best friend Maya, how she wanted to be a veterinarian. Horace listened with genuine interest, asking questions, making her laugh. Mallory watched this interaction with cautious warmth. It had been so long since another adult had shared this space. After dinner, Mallory tucked Gillian into bed with 2 bedtime stories as promised. As Gillian drifted off to sleep, she whispered a request that squeezed her mother's heart: "Please don't let Uncle Greg be lonely tonight." Mallory stepped out to the porch where Greg sat wrapped in a blanket, staring at the city lights. They talked for a while, about nothing and everything. Mallory found herself opening up about her struggles, her exhaustion, how her daughter made everything worthwhile. Horace listened without judgment. Just listened. When Mallory finally said goodnight and went inside, Horace sat there thinking about how he'd wanted to tell her the truth. That he could pay off every bill with one phone call. That she'd never have to work herself to exhaustion again. But something held him back. For the first time in years, someone was treating him like a person, not a bank account. When Mallory woke at dawn, she expected Greg to be gone. But he was still there, damp from the night air but exactly where she'd left him. Most people would have taken the blanket and disappeared. But he'd stayed. Mallory made another decision. She invited him inside. Over the next 2 weeks, an unexpected routine developed. Greg fixed the cabinet door that had been broken for months. He repaired the wobbly table leg. He figured out why the bathroom faucet leaked. He helped Gillian with her math homework, explaining fractions with patience that made the concepts finally click. He walked her to school when Mallory had early shifts. He read bedtime stories with funny voices that made Gillian giggle. The workload on Mallory's shoulders became just a little lighter. One evening, Mallory came home to find Greg helping Gillian with an art project, both of them laughing, paint on their hands. Something in her chest tightened. He looked at her daughter like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. Greg became Uncle Greg. He became part of their tiny family. And slowly, Mallory's walls began to crack. But Horace still couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. The lie grew heavier with each passing day. One particularly difficult night, Mallory came home to find past due notices for electricity and water bills on the table. The amounts were crushing, money she simply didn't have. She sat at the kitchen table and broke. 6 years of holding it together finally spilled over in tears she couldn't control. Greg found her like that. He sat beside her and offered his shoulder. Mallory wanted to lean in. Wanted to accept someone else's strength for once. But old wounds made her defensive. She pulled away, insisting she was fine, she'd figure it out. Horace wanted to tell her right then. That he could make all her problems disappear. But he was terrified that if she knew the truth, everything would change. Later that night, lying on the couch while Mallory and Gillian slept, Horace made a secret phone call. He arranged for all of Mallory's utility bills to be paid anonymously. For him, it was nothing. For her, it would be breathing room. He told himself it was just kindness. But the truth was more complicated. Horace was falling in love. 3 weeks passed. Greg became as essential to their routine as morning coffee. He was there for breakfast, homework help, bedtime stories. He made Gillian laugh and gave Mallory small moments of rest. And slowly, carefully, something grew between Mallory and Horace. One evening while making dinner together, their hands brushed reaching for the same pot. Their eyes met and held. The chemistry was undeniable. Horace leaned in, his intention clear. Mallory's breath caught. For a moment, she almost let it happen. But fear flooded in, fear of being hurt again, fear of trusting someone who might disappear. She pulled back, making an excuse. The almost kiss hung between them like an unfinished sentence. Horace knew he had to tell her the truth. Soon. But before he could find the courage, everything shattered. Was a Tuesday morning at Miller's diner when Mallory's world collapsed. Her manager Frank called her into the back office, holding a newspaper with a grave expression. He asked if she knew the man who'd been living with her and Gillian. Mallory was confused. Of course she knew Greg. Why? Frank slid the newspaper across the desk. The headline hit like a physical blow: Billionaire CEO Horace Whitmore missing for months. Below it was a photo of Greg. Except it wasn't Greg, it was Horace Whitmore, clean-shaven, in an expensive suit, standing in front of a building with his name on it. The article detailed how the $3 billion CEO had disappeared 6 months ago. His company was in crisis. Some accused him of fraud and running from responsibility. Mallory felt the floor disappear beneath her. Frank expressed concern for her safety. But Mallory barely heard him. Her mind raced through every moment of the past 3 weeks. Every conversation. Every kindness. Every almost kiss. All built on a lie. This man, this billionaire, had watched her struggle. Had watched her cry over bills he could pay without blinking. Had let her feed him from her nearly empty pantry when he could buy her entire building. He'd made Gillian love him. Made Mallory herself start to fall. And it was all fake. Mallory left work early and went home in a daze. When she walked in, Greg was helping Gillian with her reading homework, making funny voices for the characters. Gillian smiled brightly. But Mallory's expression stopped her cold. She sent Gillian to her room. Her daughter recognized that tone and obeyed. The moment Gillian's door closed, Mallory threw the newspaper on the table. Horace's face went pale. Mallory's voice shook when she asked if it was true. If he was really Horace Whitmore. If he'd been lying this entire time. Horace tried to explain, saying it wasn't what she thought. But Mallory wasn't interested in explanations. Years of being hurt poured out in angry, wounded words. She told him about the bills she'd cried over while he sat there knowing he could fix everything. About the food she'd shared when she barely had enough, while he was worth billions. About how she'd started to trust him, to care about him, while he was playing some sick game. What kind of person does that? Horace tried to defend himself. He'd been searching for someone real, someone who saw him for who he was, not what he had. Mallory's laugh was bitter. How could she see him when he'd been lying about everything? She didn't even know his real name until today. Horace insisted that the person she'd known was real. That was him, the real him, without money and power. Everything they'd shared was genuine. But Mallory was done listening. She told him to leave. Get out of her apartment and her life. And never come near her daughter again. The finality in her voice killed him. But Horace had lost the right to argue. He gathered his few belongings and walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold one last time. He told Mallory he'd never meant to hurt her. That these weeks had been the most real, most meaningful of his life. That he'd fallen in love with her and Gillian, and he'd give up everything for a chance to be their family. Mallory's expression didn't soften. If he'd really cared, he would have been honest from the beginning. She closed the door in his face. After Horace left, Mallory went to Gillian's room and found her daughter crying into her pillow. Gillian had heard everything. She asked where Uncle Greg went. When was he coming back? Mallory tried to explain that Greg had to go away. That sometimes grown-ups have problems. But Gillian asked if Uncle Greg was ever coming back. Mallory told a careful lie, Uncle Greg had to go home. He'd promised to come back, but sometimes grown-ups break promises. Gillian cried herself to sleep that night. And Mallory sat in the living room, staring at the couch where Horace had slept, feeling more alone than she'd felt in years. Because the cruelest part wasn't that he'd lied. It was that she'd started to believe she didn't have to carry everything alone anymore. Horace returned to his real life, the penthouse, the suits, the company barely holding together without him. His board was furious. The media demanded explanations. But Horace didn't care about any of it. All he could see was Mallory's face, filled with betrayal and hurt. 2 days after leaving, Horace made phone calls arranging for all of Mallory's bills to be paid anonymously. Not just the overdue ones, but 6 months in advance. He set up a trust for her rent. He couldn't fix the hurt he'd caused. But he could make her life easier. 2 weeks passed. Mallory received notifications that her bills had been paid. When she called the utility companies, they confirmed, an anonymous benefactor had covered everything. She tried to find out who made the payments so she could refuse them. But every trail led to dead ends. Eventually, exhausted, she gave up. Life continued. Work, Gillian, the same routine minus the man who'd briefly made it easier. But Gillian asked about Uncle Greg constantly. When was he coming back? Why did he leave? Did he not like them anymore? Each question stabbed Mallory's heart. 3 weeks after Horace left, Mallory came home to find Gillian unusually quiet at the kitchen table. She asked what was wrong. Gillian looked up with serious eyes and said something that stopped Mallory cold. "Mommy, Uncle Greg never cared about money. He cared about us." Mallory asked what she meant. Gillian explained with 6-year-old clarity, "Uncle Greg had lots of money, but he lived on our couch. He could buy fancy toys, but he played with my crayons. He could eat at restaurants, but he liked our grilled cheese. He didn't care about being rich. He just wanted to be with us." The words hit Mallory like a revelation. She'd been so focused on the betrayal that she hadn't considered what Horace had actually given up. He'd left billions, power, luxury, comfort. He'd slept on a couch, eaten simple food, lived a life of struggle when he could have had obscene wealth. Because he was searching for something real. And he'd found it with them. The lie hadn't been about who he was. The lie had been about what he owned. But the person he'd been for 3 weeks, fixing doorknobs, reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, that had been real. Gillian's simple observation cracked something open in Mallory's heart. What if she'd been wrong? What if Horace Whitmore, billionaire, had been just as lonely and broken as Mallory Chen, struggling single mother? What if they'd been saving each other? That afternoon, Mallory took the subway to Whitmore Technologies. The massive glass building was all marble and modern art and expensive suits. Mallory, in her waitress uniform and worn shoes, felt completely out of place. She approached reception and asked to see Horace Whitmore. The receptionist looked her up and down with condescension, asking if she had an appointment. Mallory didn't. But she wasn't leaving. She gave her name, Mallory Chen, and said it was personal. The receptionist made a call. Then her expression changed to shock. Within minutes, Horace's assistant appeared, frazzled and urgent, saying Mr. Whitmore wanted to see her immediately. Mallory was escorted to a private elevator. When the doors opened, Horace was standing there. He looked different, clean-shaven, expensive suit, styled hair, but his eyes were the same. And in those eyes, Mallory saw hope and fear in equal measure. They stood in the hallway of his executive floor, surrounded by glass and steel and wealth, neither knowing how to start. Finally, Horace invited her into his office, massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Mallory looked around at the luxury he'd left behind to sleep on her couch, and suddenly understood the magnitude of his sacrifice. She told him she'd figured out he paid her bills. Horace said he didn't want it back. He just wanted to help, even if she never spoke to him again. Mallory asked why. Why help her? Why lie? Why live as homeless when he had all this? And Horace told her everything. How he'd built his company from nothing. How success brought wealth but also isolation. How everyone wanted something from him, nobody wanted him. He'd spent 6 months testing humanity, watching people ignore and mock him. Until Mallory and Gillian stopped in the rain. For 3 weeks, he'd experienced what it felt like to be wanted for who he was, not what he owned. To be needed. To matter. To have a family. He knew he should have told her the truth from the beginning. But he'd been terrified that if she knew, everything would change. His voice broke, he'd been wrong. She had every right to hate him. But he needed her to know, everything he'd felt was real. His care for Gillian was real. His feelings for Mallory were real. He would give up everything, the company, the money, all of it, to go back to sleeping on her couch and fixing her cabinet doors. Because that life had been the only time he'd ever felt truly wealthy. Mallory listened, her heart warring between hurt and truth. She told him she'd been angry. Betrayed. But then Gillian had said Uncle Greg never cared about money, he cared about them. And her daughter was right. Mallory understood desperate loneliness. She'd spent 6 years building walls because Gillian's father had proven people leave. She'd been so afraid of being hurt that she'd pushed away someone actually trying to show up. Her voice was quiet, what hurt most wasn't that he was rich. It was that he didn't trust her enough to tell the truth. If they were going to have any chance, there could be no more lies. Horace met her eyes with fierce intensity. He promised, no more lies. Ever complete honesty about everything. Then he said something that made Mallory's walls finally crumble. He didn't want her to love Horace Whitmore, Billionaire CEO. He wanted her to love the man who'd slept on her couch. Who'd walked Gillian to school. Who'd fixed her doorknobs. That was who he really was. And if she could love that man, he'd spend his life proving he was worthy. Mallory felt tears streaming down her face. She told him Gillian cried for him every night. Asked about him constantly. Missed him desperately. And so did Mallory. She'd been so busy being angry she'd forgotten to acknowledge what was real, he'd become family. But she needed him to be absolutely certain. Because if he left again, it wouldn't just break her heart. It would destroy Gillian's. Horace stepped closer, his voice unwavering. He'd never been more certain of anything. He didn't want to visit their life occasionally. He wanted to be their family. Permanently. Forever. If she'd let him. Mallory looked at this billionaire who'd pretended to be homeless to find authentic love, and made a choice. She chose to trust. To risk. To believe. She told him yes. He could come home. But there were conditions, complete honesty. She'd keep her independence and work. And if he ever hurt Gillian, there would be no second chances. Horace agreed without hesitation. He asked if he could come home tonight. Because every day away felt like wasted time. Mallory smiled, her first real smile in 3 weeks, and said yes. When Mallory picked up Gillian from school and told her there was a surprise at home, her daughter was skeptical. But when they walked in and found Horace standing there, Gillian screamed. She ran and launched herself into his arms, crying, asking where he'd been, if he was staying forever. Horace held her tight and promised, he was home. And never leaving again. Gillian made him pinky promise. Because pinky promises are unbreakable. That night they had dinner at the same small table. Horace helped make spaghetti. They ate like family. After Gillian fell asleep, still gripping Horace's sleeve, Mallory and Horace talked about the future. He'd be CEO but prioritize family over business. She'd keep working but pursue her dream of finishing her degree in social work. They would build a life together measuring wealth in love, not money. 6 months later, Horace proposed in their kitchen while making breakfast. The ring was a sapphire, because he'd remembered she thought sapphires were more interesting than diamonds. They married at the community center where Mallory volunteered. Small ceremony. Real people. Real love. Horace moved into Mallory's apartment. Not the other way around. Eventually they bought a modest house in a regular neighborhood where Gillian could play and neighbors didn't care about net worth. Mallory finished her degree and helped other single mothers navigate the systems she'd struggled with. Horace changed how he ran his company, flexible policies, fair wages, family values. They established the Whitmore Foundation supporting single parents. Every year on the anniversary of that rainy evening, they volunteered at homeless shelters. Because they both understood what it meant to be invisible. 3 years later, Gillian gained a baby brother named Marcus. And the cycle of love continued. Years later, when Gillian told her own children how her parents met, she always emphasized one part. Her mother had $12 left. Barely enough for dinner. But when she saw someone in need, she gave anyway. And that one act of kindness, sharing a granola bar with a stranger in the rain, changed 3 lives forever. Because Horace Whitmore learned that people are more valuable than profit. That showing up matters more than showing off. That being present is greater than building empires. Mallory learned that not everyone leaves. That trusting again is possible. That accepting help doesn't make you weak. And Gillian learned that kindness creates ripples. That seeing people when others ignore them can change the world. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in a family who loves you for who you are. In fixing broken door knobs and reading bedtime stories. In showing up every single day. That's the kind of wealth that actually matters. That's the kind of love that lasts forever. This has been Boundless Love Tales. If this story touched your heart, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to believe in real love. Remember, the kindness you show today might just change your life tomorrow. Until next time, may your love always be boundless.